All right, what's going on, boys and girls? So it's been a bit since I've done a reaction video specifically related to Linux. I've done some tech and other opinion pieces and reaction videos. So let's roll into this one. This one was sent to me. It is entitled, "Is Linux Better Than Windows?" It all depends on your tools that you need. But let's find out and see what this person's got to say, shall we?
What you guys, is Linux better than Windows? That's what we're going to be talking about in this video, and also find out what is the best operating system for you. Now, I'm not going to say what is the best operating system, because basically the best operating system is always going to be down to what the user wants. And if you use Linux on a daily basis.
All right, first off, I will give this person props for making that distinction. That is one that is often far too often overlooked and not really mentioned. However, I will go as far as to say that it's actually more about the tools you need and which OS provides those tools. Example, this is all being done on Linux because it provides the tools I need for the machine and X, Y, and Z in my situation that I need. So it's beyond just what you stated. It's beyond what you need, not what you want. There's a very big distinction between what you need and what you want.
And it does everything you want it to do, then obviously that's going to be the best operating system for you. Now, obviously, there's a lot of people out there that use Windows that want to maybe take the leap of faith to Linux, but are not sure what they can do and what they can't do in Linux. And also, it is a steep learning curve when you've been using Windows for such a long time. But it doesn't mean that you can't make that leap of faith and change.
It's going to be a steep learning curve anytime you switch any underlying tool that you use that you are not, while the tools might be similar in the way, like the end result doesn't mean the way the tools get there are going to be the same way. Just going to say that.
Change your operating system. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the key features that Linux has to offer and also what Windows has to offer. So first off, let's talk about Linux itself, which is free to use. It's open source, and there are two of the key features that some people may be interested in. Now, if you're a Windows user, you obviously have to buy a retail copy of Windows, and that can cost you in excess of $300 to buy a version of Windows 10. Now, obviously, another thing for Linux which gives it the edge is the amount of versatility and variety of distributions that you have available.
I would also mention that technically, for the most part, Windows can be free if you're buying new hardware. Yeah, the cost is incorporated into the machine, more or less. Or unless you have like I think it's under 8-inch or something, and it's a tablet. Basically, the OS is free. It all depends. The cost thing, I don't always find that the best argument. People associate free with cheap, and that's not always the best brand association that you want to have. And yes, there are some distros that have a preference that you pay them, and I'll go on record as a Linux user and say I do pay for my distros because I actually donate to them. And that's the biggest thing that I think Linux users need to get out of the habit of. Oh, it's free, so it's free as in beer, and free as in whatever Stallman's crap is. Free as in freedom, freedom as in beer, and that the Linux community tends to have this like it has to be both mentality, and my mentality is free price wise is cool, but it's not going to be the determining factor whether or not I run it on a operating system that is Linux based. Form, function, all that stuff is what's going to determine whether or not I run it on Linux. So we can't always associate cost. And the thing is, the Linux community, I'm not saying this is a generalization, not all, but a good portion has this weird mentality of like you don't have to pay for it or pay for the software that's being developed. No, you should pay these guys. Donate money, donate your time. Don't show that you are thankful for the stuff that they do. Because if the way and the mentality I take it, being a Windows, Mac OS, and Linux user, is I'm going to go and pay for the tools that I use. So, Mac OS and Windows, you have like the app stores and that kind of stuff. And you'll go and pay, say $59.99 for like Sony Vegas or $99 for Sony Vegas. Why shouldn't you be donating, say, $20 to Kdenlive or KDE or whatever? It's that kind of stuff. It's that mentality that the Linux community needs to stop using it as a fucking selling point. It's great for people in situations that can't afford it, but when you can afford it, you should help these projects thrive and view them as these are tools. I should be paying for these tools.
To you, there is tons of different types of distros and distributions available to you, which you can download for free and install. And because they're open source, that gives you access to all the source code of that operating system, which then leads me to my next thing, which is customization. It allows you to customize your operating system to your needs, whereas Windows makes it a little bit more difficult because a lot of the operating system files are locked down, and you will have to use patching software to allow you to create your own themes and stuff like that, which is a big no-no for me because you don't know where these files are come from, or these patching files where they're coming from. So you can make small adjustments to Windows, but you can do massive customization to Linux operating systems. And also, if you're clever enough, you can create your own distro if that's what you want to do. So programming is a big plus side on Linux. Now, security is another big topic that people like to talk about when it comes to Linux, and they say that Linux is impregnable to malware and you won't get infected, and this is simply not true. Basically, when you look at the market share that Windows has, it makes sense for cyber criminals to go after Windows users because they have such a mass market share and a lot more people are using Windows. It's not that it's more easier to infect, it's just the fact that they've got the mass market. Now, on the downside of Windows, when you install Windows, it does install you as administrator, whereas Linux installs you as a limited user, which makes it a little bit less likely to get infected. So when you put Linux in Windows shoes, you'll probably see the same problem. Now, there is malware out there that does infect Linux, and there's also ransomware out there that can infect Linux also. So it's just basically the mass line share that Windows has. This is why you're seeing so much malware. But Windows 10 has tightened that up, and it's not as easy to infect Windows 10 as it was in previous versions of Windows. So
okay, security. This one's always interesting. Windows 10, speaking as a 10 user, Windows 10 is much better than it used to be as far as its security. It's tightened a lot of crap up that used to be problems. The administration by default being one of them, amongst other things, is still a problem. There's one thing that you don't talk about, though, as it relates to security. And Lion's Share has a portion, the fact that Windows is like 85% of the desktop market and yada yada. That plays a part. But here's the thing. The reason is the way the systems are built from the ground up. Linux is a multi-user system brought down to a single user system. Like if you're an end user, like a desktop user. i.e. normal everyday users. Windows scales the wrong way. Windows tries to scale from single user to multi-user, and that's where that particular problems come. And that's just a design difference. So a lot of the Windows problems and the security problems, and everything else, is more based around how it's designed, going from one to many as opposed to Linux, which is many to one. You know, and yes, there are things like sudo and the difference in the way security is implemented, but that again boils down to how things are scaled. Windows scales in the wrong direction, Linux scales in the other direction.
Next up would be support. What would be the support like for Linux users if they had the monopoly that Windows has? Well, as I know myself, I have been to try to get support for Linux issues, and the support was pretty poor. Whereas Windows, there is freely available to get support for Windows problems all over the internet, and even on Microsoft's forum-based site you can get support there if you want to, and you will get quite a quick response. Now, I found the response from the community of Linux users to be quite slow and sometimes ignored. And another big problem you may have is, put it into perspective here, if you had Linux with the amount of lion's share that Windows has right now, the support would be absolutely abysmal, and they would be falling flat on their face because they haven't got the amount of support for that operating system as it is right now. So I just know if it was the boot was on the other foot, you would probably see a real big problem with.
Now you're talking scale. That's a whole different level of things. Windows support. Be a non-enterprise user working in IT and call Dell. Be an everyday customer. See how far you go. Call Asus. Call Acer as an everyday consumer. See how well that support system goes. Their support is just as abysmal. Honestly, the only company that I'm aware of, that at least, and I'm not a big fan, has decent customer support, now that you usually pay out the ass for it, is Apple. And I've had my own issues with Apple. I still do. But at the end of the day, they are the ones that have the better customer satisfaction, customer happiness kind of thing, as far as like the results that they get. Whether or not like us tech heads will like the results and the way they do things, probably not. But that level of support, hate to break it to you, unless you're a $1 trillion company, you're never gonna fucking get. All these companies, doesn't matter if it's Linux, doesn't matter if it's Windows. Now, System 76 does have very good customer support from what I've dealt with them in the past for a little bit. There are a lot of, I can't speak to Dell. I know a lot of people have said that Dell's Linux support is actually pretty good now, as far as ring. A lot of these enterprises, you think IBM just spent $34 billion for a crappy support system around Red Hat? I mean, come on. Like, it's all scale. You're talking about, well, what happens if you put the boot on the other foot and make Linux the dominant market share? Those instant answers that you were going to get are probably going to be done by companies as opposed to community. That's the difference.
Linux and try to resolve issues. Now, another big problem with Linux and Windows, compared these both together, is compatibility with hardware. Now, Windows pretty much works out of the box. You turn it on and it will start to work. You download and install software off the internet and it works. It's been designed to work with Windows and it works quite well. With Linux, it works well with old systems, but the amount of hardware and software that we have available makes makes it much more difficult to make it more compatible with Linux. And I think that's just due to the fact that it's not as compatible as Windows. So probably we'll have to give that to Windows.
Compatibility. Always something that comes up. You specifically hit the nail on the head the first time and then shot yourself in the nuts being wrong on the latter part. Specifically designed for Windows. Do know it's mostly companies for profit that are building these drivers, making sure shit works for Windows. On the flip side, sometimes, not always, it's some companies, but mostly volunteers and other people trying to make shit work on Linux. The economy. One's profit driven, one's done by the community, essentially. Now, you can talk compatibility as far as hardware. I think the old systems, breathing new life into old systems is not a helpful argument. I think it's a garbage argument, actually, because there have been multiple times that you can look at, the amount of hardware Linux supports out of the box in the kernel, as opposed to, say, like the Windows kernel supports out of the box. There is a very big difference. How many architectures does Linux run on the box? Spark, ARM, take your pick. MIPS, I mean, x86, x86, 64. There are so many different architectures that Linux will run on. And at the end of the day, that's how you should be judging compatibility. Hardware compatibility out of the box, bar none, at a kernel level, is better on Linux. Windows has more support and exterior stuff built for it. Linux does not. And that would be where you would have a point. However, a lot of stuff does just work on Linux. I'm not saying everything. It's not perfect, far from it, but neither is Windows or Mac OS.
For having much more better hardware compatibility and software compatibility over Linux, in my personal opinion. You will run into problems with Linux and it will be a bit of a nightmare to get working, whereas Windows just works straight away when you install it. And all the drivers, you can generally get those straight away installed off of Microsoft. And if that doesn't work, you can go to the manufacturer's website for the motherboard.
And you just proved my point by stating exactly what you just stated while trying to prove your own point that Windows is better. Duh. For-profit companies, these auxiliary companies that build stuff for Windows to work on Windows are, of course, going to make it easy to get shit to work. If it doesn't defaultly work on Windows, that's a duh. That's an hardware OEM ODM problem, not the actual OS problem. And yes, we can get into the whole GNU Linux kernel whatever crap. I don't care. But at the end of the day, that's kind of a straw man argument to me. And here's the thing: you talk about compatibility, you're only talking hardware. You're not talking. You mentioned software, like in passing. So I'm hoping you kind of track back to that maybe a bit.
And download it. Now, sometimes this is not down to Linux's problem. It's generally down to the software or hardware creators. They don't make it as compatible with Linux. And Linux is always on the back burner. It's never ever thought about. And it's the same thing with software and games. Some software and applications are not compatible on Linux. That's because not Linux can't run them. It's just that the software companies don't create a version for Linux to work properly. They seem to, because it's such a small minority of people that are using it, they seem to just don't put the energy into creating a piece of software to make it work with Linux. And that sort of can go on and on with that sort of topic there, because that is quite a broad topic. Another thing that we're going to be talking about as well is the privacy. Now, privacy for Windows 10 has always been a big concern about data collection, about collecting data and information, whereas Linux doesn't have that problem, and that's a real big plus side for Linux. And I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future. It is open source, and I don't see them collecting data to do whatever they want to do with it, or what they're doing with it. Now, on the other side of it, there's always data being collected on the internet anyway, whether you're using YouTube, whether you're using Google, whether you're surfing habits, it all gets collected by your ISP, and the list goes on and on and on. So really, are you immune to being collected data from when you're using Linux? Probably not, because data will be collected via your browser, and you're going to get some smart one saying, oh, use DuckDuckGo or something like that. Well, everyone collects data. Even your VPN service will collect data. They say they don't, but they will do. I'm pretty sure of it. And that's just the way it works. Now, reliability and stability is...
Let's talk privacy. I'm a pragmatist. I'm a realist. Example, DasGeek and I disagree on Facebook on certain things. I do view it as a burning rage, a dumpster fire of a piece of thing that is limit. You kind of poke with a stick when you need to use it. And that's kind of what my mentality is. Whereas he is fire burned to the ground, and that's cool. Difference of opinions. It is up to the user to determine the amount of privacy. There are tools, there are places, there are things that allow a certain level of privacy. If you're talking default privacy level stuff between Windows and Linux, there is no comparison. 10 years ago, everything I typed with Windows in Windows 10 that registered and was sent back to somebody for information would have been considered a keylogger. Now it's considered a feature according to the Microsoft EULA. Linux, by default, does not exactly have that problem unless you choose a really, really dumb distro to use. And that really is all it boils down to. Now, you're getting into auxiliary arguments and stuff about, oh, well, your ISP collects data. Well, no crap. And yes, most VPNs do collect some form of data. However, to say that there are no VPNs that do not collect any data is wrong. Private internet access has been tried in court to get data, and they have zero to give, even when enforced to. There are companies that actually mean what they say. So you just got to look for it. Tor. There are ways to maintain a level of privacy on the internet, be it Windows or Linux or Mac OS or BSD. It's up to the user to implement them and then determine what level of privacy they're trying to aim for. But if we're talking just default in the system, Linux wins hands down every time. Windows 10 is much better than Windows used to be, but the fact that everything essentially gets sent back to Microsoft, from keyboard strokes to virtual keyboard strokes to mouse movements to hardware information to there's a certain level where you don't care. You don't need to know everything I put into a keyboard. And these are valid criticisms with Android too. Let's not get that twisted.
Another topic we can talk about for Linux and Windows Now, when you install software on Windows, you generally have to reboot, and of course, when you do that uninstallation, you have to reboot, and a lot of other things like updates and things like that, what you're running on Windows, you're generally forced to reboot all the time. Whereas Linux doesn't need to do that a lot of the time. It doesn't need to reboot. You can just carry on using the operating system. I think even the way you get applications and the way you get updates is a lot more easier on Linux in that sense. Also, fixing little small problems on a Linux operating system is sometimes better because they will fix it with a small little update, whereas Windows, you're going to generally have to wait for a massive big patch or an update from Microsoft to be released. So generally, these are going to be going to Linux in a sense for...
What you're referring to is Patch Tuesdays. Generically, the way Linux works is, for the most part, there are ways around that now. The generic wisdom is anytime there was a kernel update is about the only time you have to reboot. I believe NVIDIA is also another reason, but I could be wrong. Things have gotten a little weird as far as like when times you need to reboot. But for the most part, you are correct. You can keep using the system first. You can download all the updates all you want. Till you reboot, they might be updated, but it's not gonna force feed you to update like Windows 10 does, or and that's its selling point: user control.
For stability and reliability in that sense, there has been some massive problems with Windows 10 over the coming months. And years even, and it's just using people as guinea pigs to fix problems, and every release they make seems to be worse than the predecessor. Now some people say, oh, well, I'm having no problems with this version of Windows 10. Well, you've got to remember there's a lot of different hardware out there, and the way we're progressing in technology, it seems that before you know it, you bought a motherboard 6 months ago and already that's old hat, and it's moving forward. They're talking about DDR5, and it's just continually rapidly growing faster and faster, and it's sort of very hard to keep up with. Another thing that Windows suffers from is a lot of problems like blue screen of death and crashes and stuff like that. You don't get a lot of that with Linux, to be honest with you. It's much more stable in that sense. And normally it can run without being rebooted for many, many years. You don't need to normally reboot Linux, whereas Windows tends to have to be rebooted quite a lot to obviously be a lot more stable and a lot more better, because it starts becoming sluggish, whereas Linux just keeps running and running. So there is some plus points for Linux over Windows in that sort of sense. Now, also another thing that Linux is good for is it can revive old computers, really old computers, laptops, and also notebooks and old computers. You can generally install a version of Linux of your choice, and it will run straight away, and you'll get a really beautiful experience from it. And if you chuck in an SSD, it's even better, and you can actually bring a new lease of life into that old piece of hardware by installing Linux. So that's a really good plus side. Whereas if you've got an old Windows operating system on an old laptop and you try to put Windows 10 on it, it will do the reverse. It will be so sluggish and so slow because it's not compatible with that sort of thing. So that's where Linux comes into its own, in my personal opinion.
Now, here's my personal opinion. This workstation, this thing right here that I'm recording on, EliteBook A760W, 16 gigs of RAM, quad-core i7, 2nd gen, 256 gig SSD, and a 750 gig spinning drive. NVIDIA Quadro 4000 amp. Old hardware, according to most standards. Linux runs this machine perfectly fine. Windows 10 runs it perfectly fine on this machine. I generically, depending on the system, will say that yes, Linux can give longer life to new or older hardware, when others throw it by the wayside. I will say that my gripe with this argument is people are like, oh, this machine from 2000 should still run brand new, and I should be able to run all these video editors, OpenShot and Shotcut and Kdenlive and all this other stuff, and I should be able to do all that stuff on this machine that's like almost 20 years old now. Homie, that's not how tech works. So I have a problem with this argument, but I understand it. Linux needs to target something. I just don't think old hardware is the way to do it. Because for me, here's the funny thing. Down here in the corner, I have a 2008 MacBook Mac Pro, 32 gigs of RAM, 2 quad-core Intel Xenon X3 X5 365s, if I remember correctly, and 3 SSDs, a Radeon 470 RX. Linux didn't run very well on it, and some of that's because of the hardware. Yeah, throw Windows 10 on that bitch, and it works pretty damn good now. A lot of the actual gaming streaming that I do is actually from that machine. So it's relative to the hardware. It's relative, like, generically I agree, but it's not always the case, and that's going from experience. So I don't like that argument personally. I'm in the neighborhood of machines should have at least a 10-year life for what you can do. I think that's a reasonable amount of time. It's kind of like this certain debates in the Linux community talk about 32-bit being dropped and why are we all going 64-bit. Homie, newsflash, 64-bit's been around since like 2005, 2006-ish, somewhere in that time frame. You're talking almost 15-year-old tech now. It's like, why can't I use the first version of the iPhone in 15 years later? Because you don't expect to, because tech moves forward. Might not like it, but that's the reality. The one other thing I will say is developing countries that cannot get the latest and greatest and the newest hardware and all the other stuff, and they do recycle their technology. That's where Linux is. That's different. That to me is truly reviving and getting the most out of your tech, because you're taking your situation and you're trying to improve it as much as you possibly can. That is an entirely different situation. I've helped a project that is basically its goal. Like the whole focus of it is to try to revive old hardware in developing countries. And to me, I totally get that. So you want the lowest barrier to entry, the lowest cost. You want the lowest denominator possible, and that's totally fine.
Now, where Windows is king right now is the application support and also better support for AAA listed games. Now, Windows in general is better for gaming than Linux. We know that, but Linux has come on a long way when it comes down to playing games on it. Now, there is a lot of games that won't play on Linux, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops to get some of the games to even work. And I was watching a guy called Chris Titus Tech or something like that says that Linux is better than Windows for gaming, and he's obviously not a gamer, because if he was, he wouldn't be saying that. There is a lot more better support for games on Windows than Linux, and that's just a fact. And of course, that's not down to Linux's fault. That's down to the creators of the game, where they don't make a version for Linux, and that's sometimes always the case. It just doesn't play well with Linux. Now, it doesn't mean to say that it doesn't run smoothly on Linux, because sometimes you do get a lot of smooth gameplay on Linux over Windows. But to say that Linux is better at playing games than Windows is a bit clickbaity, in my personal opinion. Ease of use,
Depends on your definition of how you play them in AAA. Everyone's got a different version, it seems, of this particular conversation. Is it Fortnite? Is it PUBG? Do you consider CS:GO a AAA game? Do you consider Witcher 3 a AAA game? Do you consider a Imperator Rome a AAA game, or do you consider that like a AA or indie game? It's all relative to the user. I look at AAA, having worked in that sphere for a while, for a good 4 or 5 years. AAA is really relative to the user. Like, what games do you get hyped for? Then that's a AAA game to you, motherfucker. Like, AAA is relative. Now, if you're talking ones that have $100 million plus budgets, then yeah. But here's the thing. They recently did a survey of, I think it was the top 1,000 games on Steam, and there were either big titles or like important titles. It's the top 1,000 games on Steam, essentially, and 650 of them are playable in some way, shape, or form smoothly on Linux. That's either through Lutris or Proton or any of that other stuff. And literally, Lutris is download the damn thing, click install. Proton, same damn thing. Like, this is not the days of play on Linux, where that was the easy way of doing stuff. This is not the days of maintaining wine bottles and configurations and all the other garbage that you had to use to do, or like wine doors and wine tricks, and when crossover and Sediga and all the other stuff. Those were the good options. That's the difference. So it depends on your definition. I view gaming on a PC as a different form of a console. I don't go to Xbox expecting PlayStation games. I don't go to PlayStation expecting Xbox games. So, in that vein, oh no, I can play 650 of the top 1,000 games. That means I cannot play X, Y, or Z. Okay, whatever. I have 650 other fucking games to play. That's the difference. It's the mentality that you view AAA and the mentality that you view gaming at. Because it depends on your taste. It depends on a lot of stuff. So for me, like a AAA game for me on Linux, I like Sword Art Online Fatal Bullet. That's not considered a AAA game, but I like it. And to me, it's a big budget game from a big game company in Bandai Namco, and I can play that on Linux. It has a budget that is well above a lot of indie budgets. Not a $2 or $3 million game. It's $20-30 million. So to me, that's more AAA quality level games. It depends on your definition. Now, again, if you're talking, I want the casuals for gaming, yeah, Linux has still got a way. Like, again, it depends on your gaming experience that you want. I've had more enjoyment out of playing stuff like Ballistic Overkill and Mean Greens and stuff than I did on... like, I have 6 different COD games. I have, XY... Like, I have a bunch of different games. But I don't get enjoyment out of them. And really what AAA should determine is your level of enjoyment of a game. And the one thing that I will give Linux on is, because you can't play everything, it makes you look beyond what you normally would look at for your play styles and the stuff that interests you. One game, I love Cyberpunk, and one game I would have never bought, like, if I just looked at it, and I'd be like, I don't know how I feel about that, would have been a game called Dex, which is a 2.5D 16-bit cyberpunk open world side-scrolling action RPG. let that sink in all at once. But because I like games like I liked Syndicate, I like a lot of those kind of games, Deus Ex, and I love those games. So when this came up and I was like, give it a try. I don't even know how many hours I've put in that game. That to me is a AAA game because the level of enjoyment I've gotten out of it was better than Syndicate or Deus Ex or any of those other games. That is how you judge AAA, not budget.
Suppose we can talk about ease of use. I think that has to go to Windows. It's so easy to use, and I think Linux is a little bit more of a steep learning curve, a bit more of an enthusiast sort of operating system, in my personal opinion. Command line, a lot of stuff is command line based, and I think it could be a little bit more difficult for the average or beginner user to use Linux. It's not to say that you can't learn something. If you've been with Windows since time begun, going over to Linux will be very, very difficult for those people, but it's not to say you shouldn't give it a try, because I think everyone should try to install Linux and give it a go at some point in their life and see whether you like it or not.
Ease of use is a manufactured level of BS. Ask an Android user how well BB10 works for them. For those that don't know what BB10 is, it's BlackBerry OS 10. Then go from using BB10 to Android. Why do I make this comparison? Because I do it every damn day. And you know what the thing I find myself doing is I find trying to use Android a pain in the ass over BB10. And you know why? Because I'm more familiar with BB10. Shock. Surprise. So my bias and my outtake is going to be Android's not as easy to use. No. The difference is in ease of use is what you're familiar with. It's a novel concept. So I have always viewed ease of use as a fucking straw man because, again, kind of like gaming and the definition of AAA, it all depends on the user. That's really what it boils down to. If I set up Plasma to look like Windows and rename all the stupid shit that Plasma comes with, like whatever distro I install, Kubuntu or whatever, and rename everything what they would be named in Windows, more than likely, the person is probably going to figure out how to use it pretty damn quick because it's familiar. What people don't like is change. So this is where this ease of use fucking argument comes in. The generic design way of ease of use is more than 2 clicks to fucking change something. It's too damn hard, and people aren't going to use it. And that actually is kind of true. So, ease of use, I'm not going to give it to Windows or Linux. I'm not even going to give it to Mac OS as much as the fanboys love that OS. It depends on the user. It depends on the mindset, and like ease of use is all relative to, are you arguing, I can sit down and just play use this? That's anything. It's but you also have to approach it like, this is going to be different because it's not what I'm used to. So you have to take your personal take on stuff out of it. Like every time I go to Mac OS, I want to bang my head against a wall because just the way it operates is not how I like things to operate. It's how it operates, though. I find Mac OS to be a pain in the ass to use. I find Android to be a pain in the ass to use. But that's because my preference and experience that I would prefer is not that. That's the difference. So ease of use is a straw man to me.
Now, what I will say is I don't like to say what is the best operating system because obviously the best operating system is the one that works best for you. But what I will say is if you are going to leave Windows, make sure you do it properly and go to Linux, choose a distro and stick with it. What I do see quite a lot is Windows users going to Linux and then keeping one foot in Windows because Linux can't do certain things like play certain games or can't play certain applications because it's not compatible with it. And the thing is, you're going to have to make your choice whether you want to be with Windows or Linux. It's really difficult to play with both and fully immerse yourself into the Linux experience when you've still got one foot in Windows. Another thing I see beginner Linux users doing is distro hopping quite a lot. They go from one distro to another, different types of operating systems, and this is generally a no-no because it ends up becoming very confusing and you start losing the faith of Linux and eventually you end up going back to Windows. You need to take the plunge, choose a distribution that you like and stick with it and learn it, and you should be pretty much good to go. And once you start getting fully immersed in the Linux experience, you can then start to try other things out and try other distributions. But that is a common thing. They go backwards and forwards from Linux to Windows, from Windows to Linux, and eventually they just never sort of reside anywhere in any operating system and are in limbo, really.
I've been pretty good on this video, so if I swear, I'm sorry. I completely fucking agree with you. That bag's got a 2008 MacBook Pro running Mojave on it. This Mac Pro that I have over here is a machine that's running Windows 10. This machine is running a version of Manjaro with a different kind of UI than that ships with Manjaro. To say you cannot bounce back and forth is no. I disagree. If you're saying it's an all or nothing thing, and it is not. These are tools. You use different tools for different things. You don't have to live in a tool unless you're being one. Well, that's a different story. No. These are tools to accomplish a job and get things done. That's all these are. So this is not a great argument to me. I actually really do not like this argument. The other ones I can disagree with, but this is a valuable fucking argument that I can totally disagree with. It's not an all or nothing. It's not a one-sum end game kind of thing. It's a mindset and a willingness to try things. And that's really what it boils down to. You don't become proficient in something by always just jumping both feet in and abandoning, the fucking boat. That's just dumb to do. You could break a leg on a fucking rock. That's a bad argument. It really depends on your hardware. It depends on your situation. It depends what you're looking for. It depends on your mindset. There's so many things it depends on, and it's all personal choice. Now, as far as the distro hopping, this is something I see a lot of people doing because they watch YouTube videos looking for help or something, and they see like this person is, say somebody's running stock Ubuntu, and then they see somebody running Manjaro with KDE or i3 or something, and they're like, oh, I want to try that. Well, here's the problem. It's not always going to work because the way things are built are different. And this is on some of the fault of the Linux community. They sell stuff to beginners that are not meant for beginners. I will never recommend Solus. I will never recommend Manjaro. I will never recommend any type of rolling distribution for a new Linux user or somebody who is unwilling to understand that this is not like, if you are willing to go both feet in, here you go. Here's a Linux from scratch. Here's a Arch Wiki for you. Here's a Gentoo. Here's a Slackware. It depends on where you are looking for. If you're just looking for to install an OS, and you want stability and all the other stuff, I'm going to recommend an LTS based distro, which happens to be mostly Debian based. The Fedora fanboys and the RPM fanboys can hate me for that, but the reality is their shelf life is really short. And the rolling distro fanboys and all the other stuff, how many times for Manjaro have I had to reinstall the damn thing because, it's no longer as good as it was? It really depends on what you're doing. So it's mindset, it's marketing on a certain level from the Linux community, and it's understanding that things, just because I have this different UI doesn't mean you can't install, say, the Kubuntu desktop on Ubuntu that is running vanilla, straight GNOME. It all depends. So again, at that point I'll probably give you, but some of that's mostly on the Linux end of things and people's curiosity about, why does this look different? Because they're used to a one-size-fits-all approach, be it from Mac or Windows, and that's not how Linux is built. So when you give people a lot of choice, they're going to experiment, and unfortunately sometimes it bites them in the ass. That's just the reality, though.
But other than that, I think that's going to be about it. I've rabbited on enough about Linux and Windows, and you choose which one you want to use. Personally, I use Windows as my daily driver. I do have a Linux installed on a laptop and on a computer, which I do use occasionally, but again, I don't put much time or effort into it anymore as I used to. Again, it's entirely up to you what you want to do, and go with what you feel is right. If you want to move away from the spine thing, if that's your thing, then go over to Linux and stick there. Anyway, I think I'm going to wrap this one up. That's about it for this video. My name has been Brian from BriTechComputers.co.uk. Hope this one helps you out. Bit of a podcasty video here for you, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again. Bye for now. Now, if you haven't subscribed yet, hit the...
Okay, so overall, I'm assuming a lot of people are expecting me to get all up in arms and swear a whole crap ton more than I do. There's some good advice. This is more of a discussion that I'm having than a yelling. There's not. It's a perspective thing, and it's disagreements. This is not a somebody trying to pass off ignorance as intelligence. This is somebody who's just giving an opinion and their take from their experience, which I'm okay with. Like we're all gonna have different experiences, different takes, and different views on things. Novel idea. Maybe the rest of the world should fucking try worrying about that. But at the end of the day, some of his points, the distro hopping, that's on some of the user. That's some user responsibility. That's some of the Linux marketing aspect of things. That, there are a variety of different things that he had some points. He didn't have some points. My overall take is, while I disagree, like the AAA gaming, again, it's viewpoint. What do you view, and how do you view something? Most people would, again, expect me to rip and tear and yell, scream, and swear. I've had a few F-bombs here on this almost hour-long video now, but really, at the end of the day, it's just an opinion of his. I think he's wrong. As someone who uses if we're talking PC, I think he's wrong. It's mindset and it's view and what you're looking for out of your tech. So, I don't know. You guys aren't going to get a lot of overall exciting yelling and screaming on this video, so I hate to break it to you. You guys know what to do, though. Rate it, subscribe. Peace out.